It's so good to have everyone here this morning. Such a privilege to be with you all as well, to just share some quick thoughts. I did this title earlier, of course, 2 or 3 weeks ago, as I was trying to quickly sort of think about what it would be that I'd do for the next few weeks and try to get a jump on things. And of course, I'm still trying to figure that out at 1 o'clock in the morning on Saturday or Sunday morning. So I will get in a groove eventually. But as I thought about that title later in this week, I thought, I bet you're thinking something completely different. So I thought I'd go ahead and get that out of the way. So the famous wise man from the Middle East, Nasruddin Hoka, was visiting with a friend who was about to enter into his wedding and celebration. And so his friend said, I'm so excited I'm getting married. And Nasruddin Hoka said, I'm so excited for you. And then the guy looked at Nasruddin, and Nasruddin, of course, just reminds you, he's this wise fool, so his wisdom is awkward and contradictory and foolishness. But his friend looked at him and said, how come you haven't ever pursued a bride? How come you've never considered? Oh, no, he said, I have considered being married. Oh, yeah. He said, well, what happened? He said, well, this is what happened. Nasruddin said, I went to Ephesus and decided I'm going to find the perfect woman, just the perfect bride that could be. And he said, and I found a woman, and she was everything I thought. I mean, she was wise, and she was an amazing person and considerate, but she really wasn't much worldly. She didn't really have that sort of earthiness to her. So I decided that wasn't right. And then so I traveled to Cairo, and when I got to Cairo, I found the perfect woman, I thought, for sure. I mean, she was wise, and she was amazing, and she was kind and considerate, and then she was earthy and had this sort of roughness about her that was wonderful, but we couldn't communicate at all. It's like we spoke different languages. And so he said, I traveled all around, and then finally in one city, I thought for sure I had found the perfect woman. She was all of these things. She was wise, amazing, she was earthy, she could communicate, she was considerate and kind. And he said, well, Nasruddin, why didn't you marry her? And he said, alas, she was looking for the perfect husband. Laurie Simmons passed this on to me the other night. I thought it was perfect. I have to admit, Catwoman, you're not as I expected. So it sort of seems like that's what this title is, right? You remember the famous Broadway play, I love you, you're perfect, now change. So it's sort of, I immediately people were talking to me. So you're talking about relationships and how to find how we work together to find the perfect sort of relationship. No, it's nothing about that. So I just wanted to get that out of the way because it's really about something that happened to me when I was first ordained. And it occurred to me as one of the most amazing and difficult paradoxes that I've had to deal with since being ordained years and years ago. And I was going to look around for Bob Weathers and then George Sutton, and they're not in here. And then, of course, Nancy Froman, who used to sing with us. She's not in here. But we've all answered the same thing, and so I thought maybe I would just ask Joe to come up here as an example for everyone. Joe, would you come up here? You're not being ordained, but I just wanted you to ask the question. We have not rehearsed this, but give him a hand. So, Joe, I just need to ask, and you didn't read my blog, did you? No? Okay, good. Yeah, fine enough, because that would give the answer away. But, Joe, here's the question that I have for you. Are you perfect? In many ways. All right. Is that true? Oh, never mind. Okay. Do you think you'll be made perfect in your lifetime?
I'm working on it.
You're working on it. Okay.
It's my pursuit.
All right. Going to pursue perfection. All right. Thank you very much. Give Joe a hand. Joe would not have been ordained. The most unusual thing about Methodist ordination is that when we go before the bishop, after years of going through seminary, Methodist seminary, and after years of going through a whole process of supervision and consulting and mentorship and papers and position papers, after all of this, you stand before the bishop and the cabinet, and you stand before 700 or more other clergy and lay people who are representing all the Methodist churches in the Central Texas Conference. And the bishop asks you several questions, which you were to always answer in the affirmative, and ends with these two questions that have been asked since John Wesley founded the first Methodist meeting. The first question being, are you going on to perfection? And then the second one, before you can answer, will you be made perfect in this lifetime? Now, I've studied these questions. Every single Methodist minister has had to review what this means in John Wesley's understanding of perfection. The answer is always in the affirmative. If you intend to be ordained, and I can guarantee you that 2/3 of the ministers will swallow hard before they answer and think, isn't this somewhat of a dysfunctional setup here? I mean, we've talked about churches pedestalizing ministers and thinking they're supposed to be better. And of course, that's not here. You all know much better than that. But in a lot of churches, there is that whole tendency. And then, of course, this whole idea of being made perfect. I mean, I remember just what, I used to love this particular cartoon, Resolutions. Me, just what are you trying to imply? That I need to change? I'm perfect the way I am, after which my mom would always remind me this. I see these all over the internet. You think you're perfect? Try walking on water. And yet, you answer, yes, Bishop. Yes, Bishop. I am going on to perfection. I expect to be made perfect in this lifetime. What a strange thing to say, this idea of perfection. And yet, Joe, you're probably the common... In fact, you're probably more optimistic than most people when it comes to whether or not we think that we will actually move on to Christian perfection. Wesley had this idea. You know how we baptize babies? We don't christen babies. We baptize babies. You know, in the Methodist Church, we don't... Now, you can be baptized if you're joining the Methodist Church from another denomination, but we don't ask you to be baptized as a young adult, not the same way that other Protestant churches might do. We baptize you as babies. And the reason why is closely, intimately related to this whole idea of Wesley's notion of Christian perfection. It's because we're not saying anything to the baby. The baby's in a sort of semi-conscious state at that point. We're saying it to the rest of us. We're reminding us, don't forget, you are already loved. You are already perfect. You are already everything God could want you to be. Now all you have to do is participate, is accept, is move into it. So Wesley's idea of Christian perfection was this idea that it was already all there. It's all here. Who we are is already perfect. The verse that we have from 1 John reminds us that if we say we are of God, then we love one another. And it's not sort of affection. It's this agape. It's this compassionate. It's this empathetic. It's this attentive kind of love. That's what we were made for. Now, the reality is that as much as this doctrine is part of Wesley's teaching, it's still difficult to accept. I'm not sure that most of you will leave here feeling like, I'm not really sure I understand this whole idea. I know I'm not perfect. And if I keep telling you, yes, you are God's, you have God's seed in you, you are part of God as God is part of you, you are perfect, you might not want to stand next to me as we go outside. You might actually find yourself wanting to move a little distance. Maybe not in here, but certainly others would. Just blasphemous. How is that possible? Wesley said that love is the nature of God. I'm just going to read a couple of his ideas to try to give you a glimpse of what it was he meant. Christian perfection for John Wesley was this idea that we are simply being Christ to one another. We are fulfilling God's presence in the world. He said this, God's work is to allow the creaturely, to use his words, the creaturely elements room to be, to grow, to exercise their freedom for the sake of possibilities of love. In other words, love is relational. Love isn't static. Perfection isn't static. Perfection isn't a final product. It's not like we're moving on. Nancy, you answered these questions affirmatively, didn't you? Yes. Yes, okay, thank you. You wouldn't be here otherwise. It is this ongoing, alive, historical potential creation. It's a moving work of art in which God is inviting us to take part in a dance, literally, a dance. Partners with one another. I was talking with my wife about some of this because honestly, if we could talk ministers, we get together and you ask us, and we wrestle with this all the time. We're the only denomination that I know of, or in the world, that actually says, "Are you perfect?" and expects an affirmation from Wesleyans, from Methodists. We're the only one that does that. And as I was sharing this with Linda, my wife, who also is ordained, we were trying to think of what's a good image for this, a good metaphor, and the only one that we could come up with was this idea of a butterfly, or perhaps an apple, or perhaps anything in God's creation that when you realize as a seed, it is everything it's supposed to be. All it has to do is to fulfill itself. We are everything we have to be, but all we have to do is fulfill ourselves. And as this wonderful quote from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, he said, perfection, he's the author of The Little Prince, if some of y'all don't remember that, but he said, perfection is achieved not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing more to take away. Perfection isn't trying to become, it's trying to realize. It's trying to be present to what is already there. You know, the more I get involved with this whole idea of perfection and just thinking about mysticism and thinking about mystical practices, as Lynn brought up the singing bowl, I start to realize something. And there's some new science that's been out that's actually proven what for years mystics have always known. It's in our nature to be healed in the presence of one another. It's actually in our nature to be healed in the presence of one another. So, for example, the studies at this place called the Center for Compassion and Altruism, I read this just the other day, the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education in Stanford, at Stanford University. It suggests that this reptilian part of our brain, which is that sort of basic, instinctive part of our brain, which is always driven by two primary drives, the drive to flight or to fight, that while that is a primary motivator in all of our lives, last week I talked about how we always default to the negative, how so easy for us to simply think the negative in response to things. We just kind of go there. We're self-critical, we're critical of others, and then we have to remind ourselves how to be positive. The Buddhists have this wonderful practice that they call the smile of Buddha, and it's simply to retrain the brain. It's simply to retrain our consciousness, our focus, our attention by smiling. And yet, that's not where our brain will go automatically because we have this instinctive drive, this reptilian drive to sort of fight or flight. I love the passage in the verse in 1 John 4 that we've just read where it says, perfect love casts out fear. Most of what we believe, much of what we practice in our day-to-day work lives, much of what we pursue for our sense of happiness is based in those two basic instinctual drives. We are afraid. It's either fight or flight. So that even a lot of our beliefs, whether these are beliefs that you remember from, as I do, from some of my most evangelical days as an adolescent, they were for this sense of security, for this sense of not hope, more like calm my fear. But this verse says something really significant to that, to all of those beliefs, I think. And it says that perfect love casts out fear. I think what that suggests, because in the context of that verse as well, in that if we say we are of God, then we are of this same love, and we practice it with one another. I think what it's saying is it is challenging us to challenge that drive, to challenge that tendency. Now, the research at the center, what it showed was is that most everything we do releases dopamine. Now, I'm just going into the scientific thing real quick because, as I said, I love the fact that hundreds and hundreds of years later, science proves what mystics have always done, and that is when it releases dopamine, it causes an immediate sense of satisfaction, immediate euphoria. And so we do things, all the basic drives, whether it's sex or whether it's food or whether it's sleep, all these basic drives can create immediate senses of euphoria. Now, that made perfect sense when we were primitive and we needed to go hunt because we needed quick motivation, quick energy. So we sought for things. We had this hunting mentality, this gathering mentality, and it gave us a sense of quick euphoria. And then we'd rest, and then we'd start back over again. But nowadays, what happens? What's a primary drive to create that same euphoria? That same release of dopamine? Well, I don't know what it is for you. For me, it used to be a bookstore. I'd walk into a bookstore and I'd think, I love books. And I'd immediately just have this sense of, oh my gosh, I feel so good. And then I'd reach up and I'd find books. Now, I've overcome this because I've been attending Bibliophile Anonymous, and I'm doing much, much better. And thankfully, there are less, well, actually, there is, of course, Amazon, and that's not been easy. But, I just love reading. I love studying. I love thinking through things. And you see all these wonderful books. And you'd pull them off the shelves. And then eventually you'd have this stack of 10 or 15 books. And then what happens? Then it sort of takes over, this sense of guilt, this sense of fear, this sense of being overwhelmed. And so then I'm caught between both of these emotions. And there's no more dopamine. It's more like a crash at this point. For some, it's food. For some, it's shopping. For some, it's different activities. For some, it's thrill-seeking. We try to find ways. For some, it's simply the career, or it's hopping from one new home to the next new home, or perhaps one relationship to the next relationship. But we seek that feeling. We're created for it. Now, here's the thing they found. They found that when people relate to one another, interact, and here's the key, intentionally. When they pay attention, when they literally focus on each other and pay attention, there's another hormone that's released, oxytocin, which creates the same euphoria, but lasts. It imprints and lasts longer. And not only that, it's been shown to enhance immunity in your DNA. Now, I'm not saying that the writers of the Gospels and of these epistles knew exactly what they were talking about, but I am thinking that perhaps mystics have known all along. There is something about listening to one another. There is something about being present to one another. There is something about being present to your own emotions, your own anxieties, your own sadness, your own grief, your own fears, but being present to them as opposed to trying to run from them. There is something about being intentional. Paul Tillich called it, the theologian Paul Tillich called it right relationship. That what it meant to be related to God in whom we move and live and have all of our being was to simply be in right relationship with one another. But not just with one another, in right relationship to self, in right relationship to God, in right relationship to creation. And all of that revolves around that simple act of love. That act of empathy, of connectedness. The name of the blog that I've started as part of this it's called The Space Between. Some of you might be familiar with that phrase. Martin Buber, who was a Jewish philosopher, had this philosophy that he called I-thou relationship. He contrasted it with the I-it relationship, which is so predominant in our Western culture and our Western way of thinking. In fact, it's prominent in dualistic thinking in general. It's it and it's me, or it's we and it's they. But it's never me and we. That's more of an almost Eastern concept in some ways. But Martin Buber suggested that what God's presence in the world is about, the one in whom we move and have our being, that presence is about me and we. It's about I and thou. And that in every interaction, when people truly are present with one another, when we are truly present with ourselves in that way, truly present with creation, then we are actually in the presence of the divine, in that space between. The old phrase, "'Tis better to give than to receive." It actually is. But there's the key. This is the strangest thing. It has to be intentional. You can't do it out of guilt. You can't do it out of a sense of I'm trying to have a karmic relationship with the world around me, and I figure if I do enough of this, something's going to return to me. It's simply out of the desire to be present with one another, and the desire to be present with yourself, and the desire to be present with creation. And in that process, we are made perfect. We are perfectly living out who God created us to be. So just a couple of things you can do real quickly. Replace these things. You can make a mental note. Replace getting with giving. Practice a little more giving. Practice doing it intentionally. Now, what is giving intentionally? It literally means just giving. Not trying to manipulate, not trying to think it out, not trying to think about, well, I could do this much. It means just letting go. Try that. Try, instead of thanklessness and anxiety about what you're going to succeed at or how you're going to look or how you're going to impress yourself or someone else, try instead to just be grateful. Practice a little gratitude. And then I recommend that you try a little Buddhist smiling. You know, the practice of Seizen is all about simply sitting there. But if you've ever done Seizen before, sitting meditation, one of the earliest things they teach is they say, deep breathe, focus on your breath, but do it with the slightest smile. Just the slightest, gentlest smile. And everywhere you travel, you know, as you're walking about, just smile. Do that with so many encounters throughout the day. And of course, you'll get some weird looks. And of course, folks will ignore you. And others will suddenly be transformed. But in the process of just smiling, you are literally changing your brain, your neurotransmitters. You are literally opening up God's presence in our midst. So we have this. We know and believe that love, the love that God has for us. God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. Love has been perfected among us in this, that we may have boldness. Because as God is, so are we in this world.